Donald Trump wants desperately to get the Nobel Peace Prize. He's in a rush. He told us at one stage that during the election campaign that he would take only 24 hours to resolve this war. Of course, this is somebody who never reads a book and has absolutely zero understanding of Ukraine and the Ukrainian people. Back in 2018, Trump actually made similar comments to what his own people are saying today. Crimea is Russian. They speak Russian in eastern Ukraine. They therefore must be Russians. His view of the world is that of an elementary school child. The idea that because you happen to be a Russian speaker in eastern Ukraine does not make you a Russian or make you pro-Russian. In the same manner as that majority of Canadians speak English outside of Quebec, certainly, does not make them Americans. Or the majority of people in Ireland speak English does not make them Englishmen or whatever. So that is simply a very simplistic way of looking at this war. Secondly, they don't understand the roots of the war. Russia keeps talking about the need to resolve the roots of the war. They keep using this phrase. The Trump team never talk about the roots of the war. What are the roots of the war? Well, in Russian eyes, the roots of the war are very simple. Ukraine cannot be Ukrainian. Ukraine has to be Little Russia. So therefore, Ukrainian identity has to be destroyed. And back in the spring of 2022, when Russia first tried to impose its own understanding of a so-called peace agreement, in effect capitulation on Ukraine, there was a list of about 3 to 4 pages of legislation that Russia demanded Ukraine repeal. This is legislation dealing with language questions, culture, education, memory politics like decommunization, foreign policy, and the status of the Russian Orthodox Church. So all of these national identity questions were to be repealed, and Ukraine would instead replace these with a dominant Russian language, dominant Russian Orthodox Church, etc., etc. So in Russia's eyes, or in the Kremlin's eyes, the only Ukraine that can exist is one which is a little Russia modeled on Lukashenko's Belarus. And of course, a little Russia which is smaller in territory, because this would be after the south and east, and Crimea would be taken and incorporated into Russia. So the idea of this kind of what is entailed in this war is simply absent in Washington, and therefore they are trying to push this peace process along without really a very deep understanding of what is taking place. And in many ways, this is because the United States, at least under Trump, maybe not under his predecessors, acts in the same arrogant manner as Russia is towards Ukraine. So the same arrogance that Russia is professing towards Denmark, which legally owns Greenland, or towards Canada, is the same kind of arrogant, great power approach towards of Russia towards Ukraine. The little countries don't matter. The only important countries that matter are the United States, Russia, and China. And this is a viewpoint that in Moscow they've wanted to hear for a long time, because this is what they really believe. They don't believe Ukraine is a real country, just like the Trump team don't believe Canada's a real country, or that Denmark's a real country. They have no respect for other countries, as we see. It's not just that the Trump team don't have respect for Ukraine. They don't have respect for Europe. They don't have respect for Canada. There's no respect for Mexico. The only respect is with big players like Russia, and hence this nearly 2-hour telephone conversation between Putin and Trump, which didn't resolve anything, didn't get anywhere, where they just talking like lovers. I mean, what were they talking about for nearly 2 hours? It's the longest telephone conversation between American and Russian leaders ever, and yet nothing came of it. The same arrogance that Russia says Ukraine's a fake country, an artificial country, the same arrogance America says Canada's an artificial and failed country. It's just should be just a province of United States. Ukraine should be just a province of Russia. The same kind of lack of understanding that Canada has a very long identity since the early 19th century. Well, certainly since the American Revolution, because the Canada was formed by people who immigrated from France to Quebec, plus English speakers who rejected the American Revolution and supported Great Britain and moved to Canada, so-called empire loyalists. So the idea that somehow just because they speak English on both sides of the border, they're American and therefore they should join us is as simplistic as Russia claiming it has a right to control Ukraine because allegedly half the country speaks Russian, which of course is not true today. So I've always been very skeptical that a ceasefire or some kind of peace agreement can be reached. And that skepticism has actually grown with the Trump team, even though possibly Trump certainly wants a peace agreement because then that gets him his peace prize, his Nobel Peace Prize. But they're going about it completely the wrong way. They're not being tough on Russia. They're being tough on Ukraine. Then Russia rejects the ceasefire. There's no comeback. Ukraine agrees it. So what? The very fact that there's no kind of demands on Russia, no extra sanctions, no attempts to pressure Russia. In fact, the opposite, where the Trump team is giving away potential bargaining chips, like it's saying, well, Ukraine's going to have to accept that it's lost its territory, Ukraine can never join NATO, etc., etc. Well, then that's already giving, you're preempting the negotiations. You're not using those as potential bargaining chips with Russia, and you're reinforcing the tendency which still exists on the Russian side for them to hold a maximalist position, which is what they have. And their maximalist position includes 4 or 5 areas that, of course, Ukraine will never agree to. So how the United States will be able to convince Ukraine to agree to these, I have zero understanding of. And these demands are: Ukraine recognize 4 regions of, and unlike Mr. Witkov, I can say what these regions are: Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Kherson, plus Crimea. So areas occupied in 2014 and 2022. Recognize these as Russian. Ukraine will never agree to that. Zelensky couldn't, even if he wanted to. Transfer over to Russia territories in those 4 regions which are still controlled by Ukraine. Again, Ukraine said no way. Ukraine demands the return of, the official number is 20,000 children stolen by Russia, but the real figure is far, far higher. Again, there's been no response from the Russian side for this. These children are undergoing massive de-Ukrainization and Russification in camps, either in Crimea or inside Russia. Their Ukrainian identity is literally being scrubbed from their minds by Russia. Thirdly, the idea that Ukraine would change its constitution and remove the goals of NATO and EU membership. Again, that's not going to happen. Firstly, it would require a 2/3 majority of the Ukrainian parliament, and Zelensky doesn't have those numbers, even if he wanted to, and I don't think he does. So again, how's that going to change? Fourthly, I've already mentioned this so-called the roots of the war, the idea that Ukraine will have to change lots of legislation to make itself more Russian and less Ukrainian. Again, that's not going to happen, and the Ukrainian parliament will never agree to this. So there's a whole range of areas which, from the Ukraine sound not like a peace negotiation, but sound like Russia continues its demands from spring of 2022 that that Ukraine should capitulate. This is not a kind of a compromise on both sides, it's capitulation. Now, the other angle to this is the pro-Russianism of the Trump team refuses to acknowledge that Ukraine has its own agency, because Ukraine's not an important country. It's a little country like Canada or Panama or whatever. They're not important. But in fact, when Trump and Vance told Zelensky in the Oval Office that Ukraine has no cards, this is simply wrong. It's not true. The idea that Ukraine is about to be defeated by Russia is completely mythical. You can go around the internet, find lots of analysis of very well-respected military analysts and experts, and none of them will say Ukraine's about to fold and collapse and be defeated. It's simply not true. So this, again, this is one of the myths of the Trump team, which they have bought into, believing that Russia is invincible. And we've had this from day one of this invasion. Let's remember that Western governments back in February 22 were all convinced, every single Western government was convinced that Ukraine would last a few days and it would be quickly occupied and there would be a puppet regime installed in Kyiv. So Western governments only came to Ukraine's aid in April of 2022, after Ukraine had proven it could defeat Russia in the Kyiv region. For 2 months, Ukraine was basically on its own, from February to April 22. Only in April of 22 did Western leaders like the Brits, the Balts, the Poles, the Americans, all started visiting Ukraine, visiting Kyiv in April, not February or March, April 22. Justin Trudeau always came late in May, the following month. But that again showed the lack of sort of understanding of Ukrainian agency, the lack of determination of the Ukrainians to defend themselves, the lack of understanding of what drives Ukrainian identity. And it was a kind of a legacy of 30 years of viewing Ukraine as somehow part of Russia or somehow within the Russian sphere of influence. And that is obviously there in bucketfuls in the Trump team. They don't get that even without American assistance, and there has been no American assistance, the only American aid coming to Ukraine in the last few months is what was provided for by the Biden administration. There's no Trump military aid coming through. No. So even without American military aid, Ukraine would still survive. It would be difficult, but what everybody seems to, or practically everybody seems to ignore, is that about 40%, some say 50%, but let's say keep it at 40% of military production or military equipment used in Ukraine is made inside Ukraine. Ukraine has massively built up its defense sector and is today in one of the top 5 countries in the world producing very advanced military equipment. If the war was to end today, Ukraine would be one of the top 5 exporters of military equipment. The new forms of drones and other types of equipment, similar equipment coming out is literally every month. There's something like 300 small defense companies operating in Ukraine. So Okay, 40% of Ukrainian military equipment produced internally. Some of this is with Ukrainian government money. Some of this is with Western government money or interest money from frozen Russian assets transferred to Ukraine. Denmark has led the way in this. Rather than providing military equipment from its own stocks, it gives the funds to Ukraine, and then Ukraine builds up its own military industrial factories, which of course provides work, taxes, and employment inside Ukraine, and is better. It means you don't have to transport it. On top of that, Europe is now finally getting its act together. Europe here, I mean in a broad sense, European Union, Britain and Norway. And again, the Trump team refuses to acknowledge that Europe, again, I include Britain and Norway here, together has given more military and non-military aid to Ukraine than the United States. So Trump's still on this illusion that the United States has been the main provider. That's not true. If you look at the actual figures. So, yes, Ukrainians would like to have a cessation of military hostility, particularly the drone and missile strikes every day, a chance to rebuild their country, with maybe part of their territory occupied by Russia temporarily. But they are not going to agree to some kind of capitulation, whether forced upon them by Russia or forced upon them by the Trump team. That simply would be impossible for Zelensky to push through, and I don't think he would agree to that. Russia is not winning this war. Russia, by May of this year, so by within 2 months of this year, Russia will have had 1 million casualties. Shall I repeat that? 1 million casualties. That's killed and wounded. As we know, most Russian wounded die. They're either shot by their own side or they're simply left to die. This is not like Ukrainian or NATO wounded who are retrieved from the battlefield and are saved. To put that in perspective, that is 20 times more than Soviet casualties in Afghanistan over 10 years. There they lost 50,000. And let's remember that was 50,000 from all of the Soviet nationalities. Ukrainians, Russians, Georgians, Lithuanians. Here we're talking 1 million Russians. And they have not got anywhere. In the spring of 2022, Russia controlled or occupied about 30% of Ukraine. Today, they occupy 20%. They have not managed to expand the amount of territory that they occupy in Ukraine, despite these massive casualties and massive destruction of Russian military equipment. So Russia is not doing a great job on the battlefield and is not winning on the battlefield. How this in the end, what kind of agreement Trump reaches, I have my very big doubts, but without some pressure from the Trump team on Russia to back down from its maximalist demands, I simply don't see where this can go into some kind of lasting peace agreement. Everybody understands that there cannot be an agreement signed like was signed in Minsk in 2014, because this would just lead to a third invasion down the road. So let's see if Trump can pull a rabbit out of a hat, if he can be a magician. I think he wants desperately that Nobel Peace Prize, but he's going about it completely the wrong way by not being balanced between Russia and Ukraine and not applying pressure on Russia to compromise from its maximalist positions. There also needs to be a different approach to Ukraine and recognize that this is a country that will not capitulate and which has done a valiant job in defending itself against a country which is far bigger in population, size, and manpower. Thank you.